All right, so we're now going to move on to onyx tree conifer, which is used to make obviously pine trees. And so I have it open right now with just the default tree, and so I turned on shading and hit the helix to get it to draw. And what you'll notice right off the bat is that it pretty much looks identical to onyx broadleaf. And so let me draw the helix. So once you know broadleaf, you basically know conifer. The differences are really minor. Obviously, you will see that we have, the height of our tree, we have, and the size of the tree. We have our elements, so the trunk, bough, which again is the main branches off of the trunk, branch 1, 2, and 3, the twigs, and the foliage, or in this case, the pine needles. That's really the big difference between pine trees and broadleaf trees is that with onyx conifer, you get these little needles that emit off of your branches or your twigs as opposed to leaves that have a width to them. And so you do have control over the width of the pine needles and the length of the pine needles in onyx, but that's pretty much it. It is designed just to do pine needles. Um, and so we have our wireframe and shaded mode, our sun and shadow, same controls for zooming in and the move tool. We do have this little saw, which also was in broadleaf, which I don't believe I showed you. But if you click on the little saw, you can just cut off a branch. And so that's kind of cool. So I just cut it right there. Um, we have the same exact wind controls. So if I turn wind on and I hit the helix, now it's going to draw it with a little bit of wind. And we have the wind properties. And you'll notice by default the speed is set to 0. And so if I go in here and I bump that speed up to 37 kilometers per hour, now we can see that tree being blown to the right. And so obviously I can again, go in and change the wind direction, and we'll see the result of that. So let's go in and hit OK. And then we can just turn the wind off and redraw. And now there's the pine tree with no wind. And while it does have all the same controls down here for wind and playback and frame rate, one thing that I will say right off the bat with Onyx Conifer is that it doesn't have controls, or at least not yet anyway, to export the animation in an OBJ sequence. So they added it to Broadleaf, but they haven't added it to Conifer. So you'll see if I go to File, Save Model as OBJ, it looks very familiar. I can hit count, I can change, and I can see that B2, 3, and the twigs have no polys in them for this tree. But importantly, you'll notice there's no export as OBJ sequence. So I'm sure that's coming, but it doesn't have it yet. So let's close that. Then on the right, in what we can call our sort of attribute editor region, just like with broadleaf, we have the bough and trunk height controls, our branching and twigs, our trunk shape, so the width and the molding of that trunk. So you can kind of see subtly that this trunk here does have some molding on it. And then the controls for your pine needles, which you can see is a little bit simpler than we had in broadleaf for leaves, because you basically just have length, angle, whether they curve or bend, their density, and then under length, if you click for more options, control for the width. And so you'll see on this default pine tree, the needles are 5 millimeters wide. So that's pretty much the difference from the UI perspective, which is, practically nothing, which is good. So it's nice that they're consistent. But the thing that's obviously useful with Onyx Conifer, just like with Broadleaf, is that it does come with a pretty extensive library. And so if we go under Load Parameters, and you can see that I'm in the Conifer library for Onyx Tree. So just like with Broadleaf, we have a few different folders. And so we have your standard Conifer library, some nice Conifer trees in there, and then some kind of fantasy trees in these folders. So if we go to the normal Conifer library, you'll see, as with Broadleaf, we have a bunch of Latin names. And we do have our tiny little preview. And I can just use the up and down arrows to go through these. And so, obviously this one right here, let's open that one. And let's go and hit the helix. It's a pretty generic pine tree, so something that we would associate as being a Christmas tree. And with it, one thing to really point out with onyx conifer is that since you have these needles on conifer or pine trees, you end up having really, really heavy trees. So your trees with onyx conifer will end up being much heavier than with broadleaf if you really want to have a realistic density of all of these pine needles. And so if I go and say File Export on this guy and hit Count, you'll see this is 310,000 polygons. And some of the presets in here are in the millions. So the main thing to watch out for really in the end is how much RAM you have. And so as I've said a couple times, my machine that I'm using has 12 gigs of RAM, but it supports up to 48. I just haven't needed more than the 12 gigs that I have. But if I were to export, 20 different trees from Onyx and they all were a million polys, so I have 20 million raw polys in my scene that I'm going to instance, at that point I potentially would need to get more RAM. But then it would work. So, RAM these days is a lot cheaper than it used to be. So I really feel that, the poly count is something that I'm not too concerned about anymore, which is awesome. So if we look in on this tree, the thing when you're dealing with these presets and trying to make your own trees is to always pay attention to the height. So you have an idea of what you're making. Because if you're trying to make a Christmas tree, normal size one, let's say like a 7-foot tall Christmas tree that you would be putting in a scene that's about the same height as a person, that would mean you would want your Christmas tree to be about 2 meters tall. And I can see this one is 2.83 meters. And so very simply, I can just go in Onyx and go to my trunk, and I can see that my trunk height is 2.5 meters. So if I wanted this to be closer to the height of a person, we can go down to 1.8. And now you'll see the total height of my tree is 2.1, because obviously the branches are making it a little bit taller. So I can be like, well, that's fine, but now so that I shorten the trunk, the branches look a little long, so the tree is looking a little fat. So if I can go to the bow, you can see that we have controls for the bow length. And so in here we have min length, top bow length factor, keep the top bow length. So but let's go to the bow length and see what happens if I shorten that down. You'll see that obviously it's redrawing funny, but now the tree is getting skinnier. And so, or I can just go and make some changes there. So now we have a tree that's shorter, so it's around 2 meters and still has that same shape. And then the density of the branches in there is going to be controlled by the bow density. There's 20 centimeters between each one. So if I want this to not have so many gaps in it, I could lower the bow density maybe to 13. And now you can see it gets a little bit more filled out, or lower it down to 10. So modifying the settings in here is very, very intuitive. So this tree, now that I've made these changes to it, if I go into Save Models OBJ, you can see now drop down to 186,000 polys. But in the end, obviously you have to be thinking about, the distance between all these pine needles. So let's just go into shaded mode and see if this wants to draw. Onyx definitely has an issue with doing the shaded drawing once your poly count goes up above a certain limit. And so you'll see that it drew and then stopped. And so that's something that, I just stick in wireframe mode and it's fine. So if I look in here and I want to get the pine needles, or have a little bit more say over what's going on with those, the next really critical attribute that you want to look at is your needle width. And on this tree, I can see the needle width is 1 millimeter. So you're going to want to look at some reference and just think like with something like a Christmas tree, those needles are very, very, very thin. As some of the presets have needle width, at something like, let's say 5 millimeters. So you can see these get a lot thicker. And so that's just one of the first things I would look at with any of the presets is what's the needle width, and is that in line with what I'm trying to create. And so if I put this down to 2, then they'll just get a little bit thicker. One useful tip though for trees that are in the midground and the background is that instead of adding more needles, you can always cheat and just make the needles a little bit wider just to fill in. And for mid to background trees, that's a really good way to keep your polygon count lower, is to just make thicker needles. So for far away trees, especially if there's going to be some depth of field or motion blur in the scene, that'll work. But for an up close tree, you're going to want your needle width to be a little bit more accurate. So here I would say maybe 2 millimeters. So that means that if I want a little bit more density, then I can see under needle density there's 3 millimeters between each needle. And if I click on that, you can see you have a bunch of controls over the spread between the trunk and bough and branches and twigs. So if I want to get more needles in here, I have to go to the needle density, and I can lower it down to 2 millimeters. Now they're going to get a little tighter. Save models OBJ, and now this has jumped up to 244,000 polys. So that's pretty much the basics in the UI. There's not a lot more to talk about. We just want to take a look at some of the different trees that are in the library, and then obviously we'll go over to Maya and talk about creating shaders for pine trees. So let's look at the library a little bit more. Now, I just quickly opened up the directory where Conifer is installed, and I mentioned it for broadleaf, but I didn't show it to you, is that, you know, Onyx does come with this index, where if I go to Common to Latin, and I take a look at this text file, it's really useful because it just allows me to see what the normal name is for these conifer trees, or the common name, versus the Latin name, and so that you can find what you're looking for. So if I scroll down here, let's say I'm, want to see what's available, then there's going to be things that you might, recognize. Let's say like, a yew tree or a fir tree is something that you might recognize more than, a Latin name just like this. So scrolling down, there's obviously a lot of stuff inside this library. So one thing that you'll notice is that you won't see a redwood tree in here, which, was one of the first things I was wondering with, Onyx is where are the redwood trees, since those are, huge conifer trees. They're not in here, but there is one in the Con7 directory. And so if you look inside here, you'll see that there's a couple redwood trees in there. And so the Con directory, you can see, has a little bit more common names as opposed to Latin names. So let's go and load another tree. Let's go and just scroll through here, and we can see there's quite a lot of variety with these different kinds of trees. It'd be great if the preview also showed you the height of the tree, because that's kind of one of the critical things you wonder about when you load these in. Because, you look at something like that and it's like, that looks like that's probably a huge tree. And then you open it up and we can see inside here, hit the helix, that's actually pretty big. It's almost 6 meters tall. And so if I, again, being American, my conversion of metric to feet is not great. But around 6 meters is, to me, something around, 12 to 15 feet tall. So it's like twice the height of a person. So it's definitely not massive. But let's go and load, and let's say we go and jump up to the Con7 directory, where we can see we have a bunch more stuff. So we have some cool cypress trees, something called Jeffrey's pine, which is kind of neat looking. And let's go and find those redwood trees. So here we have 3 different redwoods, so all of which give you a useful start point. And if I load one of these in, you can see this guy is 25 meters tall. So this is a really big tree. And for it, if I go to the needle length and needle width, you'll see the needle width is only 2 millimeters. So you have this really, really tall tree with really, really thin needles. And so what does that mean? Your poly count is going to be huge on this guy. So if I go and let's do a save models OBJ on this one and count. And this is 2 million polygons. So obviously if you're going to have something this big and this tall, all with tiny little needles and good density on it, it's going to get heavy. So if we use the magnifying glass and zoom in on this guy, so as we zoom in, we can see that things are very, very heavy with this. And the way that it's drawing the needles right now, let's get a little bit closer, is it's drawing them kind of as let's get a little bit closer, as crisscross segments. So let's see if shaded mode is going to want to show us that. There you go. As opposed to drawing the actual individual needles. That's an export option with Onyx to try and just save memory. Because if we go to save model as OBJ, and this guy says it's 2 million polys, What you should notice here is this little button. And so this button basically tries to lower your polygon count by changing the way it exports needles. So if I set the needle or click the button again, and it's going to recalculate polys, you can see now it's taking a really long time. Because in the mode where you can actually see the individual needles on that button, then what that means is that it's actually drawing the needles like we've been seeing on the other trees. And now the polygon count went up to 11 million polys for this tree. And so the alternate export type that you have is to click that button, and all of the needles along a branch will actually just be two 90-degree planes that are intersecting each other, where you could map a texture map that has a whole bunch of needles on that one texture to try and fill it in. So that's what's going on here with this redwood. So if you import something like this and see like, well, where are all the needles? That's just a way that Onyx tries to sort of save you some polys. So you could imagine with all of these little planes that are intersecting each other, the OpenGL display is not great, but you can just imagine having a texture that has a bunch of needles on it, and then having those be intersected 90 degrees. So this is not going to look good for an up-close tree, but for a tree that's really far away, you'll be able to get away with it. So that's the thing with the Onyx Redwood preset. So let's get into wireframe mode, or just line shaded mode, and let's zoom out a little bit of the sky. And even in this display mode, you can see it still takes quite a while to draw. And in regards to the needle display in the UI, if we go to needles and go to needle length, we have the width, which you can see is at 2 millimeters. But if we go to needle density, there's 7 millimeters between each needle right now. But specifically in the options, you can see we have our needle spread, and then there's that button again. So basically, it can be set in either mode in your UI, but in your export options, you can also make a choice there. So right now it's set to displaying the needles as cards. And if I click it, now it's showing the needles as needles. So I can hit OK and then zoom in here again. And now you can see as we get closer that it is drawing individual needles in there. And so it should be clear why we're dealing with 11 million polys when this thing gets converted. And so if I go in here and get into wireframe mode, let's try shaded mode, see if that's going to want to work. You can see that with these needles look really, really tiny, but remember that this is let's go back into wireframe, a really, really tall tree. So you really have to compare to the settings over here, and you can see these needles are 30 millimeters long. And so that's definitely not hugely long, but the people who created Onyx, like I've mentioned before, are people who specialize, in the study of trees and plants. And so I believe at least one of them is a botanist and a scientist. And so that means that when they create these presets, they're, looking at reference and trying to be accurate. So, as far as I know, this means that a redwood tree has 30 millimeter long needles that are 2 millimeters wide. Obviously, there are pine trees out there that have needles that are much longer than that. But again, in here, this is just going to create something that's really heavy. And so here I can zoom out, and we have that redwood tree. So going back into the library, and just, we can scroll down to the bottom and scroll up. So use shrubs, so that means those are going to be small because they're shrubs. Let's go and take a look at, let's say, maybe some of these cypress trees. So there's 3 of them. Let's go and grab one of those. Let's get that to draw. You can see this guy's looking pretty heavy. It's 2.47 meters tall, so not super tall. Go to the needles, 20 millimeters long. 3 millimeters wide, so they're a little thicker, and then we can see they're drawing as regular needles. And so for this cypress tree, save as OBJ, polygon count, 1.7 million polys. So yeah, pine trees are heavy. That's just the way it is. So also with this tree, you can see that since there's so many needles on it, they made the decision that maybe you don't need the branches or the twigs. So you can see that those are not being displayed right now. So if I turn the needles off, we can see, just the trunk and the bough. If I turn the branches on, you can see that they are in there, meaning there are settings for them, and I can turn on B2. And you can see now it's getting rather heavy just with branches, and that's probably why they decided to turn it off. So if we just go into wireframe mode, and then let's turn the leaves on, or rather the pine needles. Now obviously with B1 and B2 on, go to export, count, we're going to get much higher than 1.7, not that much higher, went to 1.8. So in the end, not a big deal, only 56,000 polys for branch 2. And like always, you have to evaluate how far away from camera this tree is going to be, so you can decide if you can get away from switching it from geometry, that is thickness, to polyline, because in here, that's something to be aware of. And also, importantly, the same thing goes for your needles. So you'll see that the needles right now also have the choice of being, having thickness, which really only makes sense if you're going to be crazy close to them, or being polyline. So if I go and switch to polyline for the needles, you can see my polygon count just dropped in half. And then branch 2 in here is really, really skinny. And let's say we're going to be far away from this pine tree, so I could try putting that to polyline as well. So now I'm at 655,000 polys, and that's a far more realistic poly count if I want to get a bunch of trees into the scene. So why have 1.8 million if you can get away with 655,000? So we have it drawing as needles. We have our trunk. We can see our trunk inside here as far as its curving resolution is 5-sided. And same kind of stuff as with broadleaf. So if we like a tree and we want to export it, of course, you just end up hitting the save button. So we don't have controls for number of P objects like we had with broadleaf, and we don't have controls in here for the resolution, as you can see in the export for the needles. And so basically it's a lot simpler from an export perspective. We're not worrying about convexity and curvature and P objects and random scale and anim export and fixed segments. All these things that we dealt with broadleaf are not in here. And so it just makes your life a little easier, really. Although it's a little bit more limiting. So if I choose to save this guy, you're going to get your little warning. And then once I click yes, we can see that I have a few Onyx exports that I've already exported in a folder called Onyx Exports on my desktop. And so in here, let me just go and export that again. So file, save models OBJ, save. It's got its name. So if I look inside the trees I've exported, you can see I don't have a cypress tree in here. So let's just hit save. And then that'll take a few seconds to save, get the little beep, and that's done. So I think that as far as Onyx goes, really what we want to do is just go through, and it looks like Onyx has decided to freeze. Oh, there we go. Go through and load a bunch of different trees, or rather what you should do, because I've already done it. But go through and just experiment with all the different trees. I really don't think that it's necessary for me to, go through a bunch of them and look at the settings, because it's so easy. So if you look at something like Jeffrey's Pine, which is quite different than the other ones, then if I open this one just because it's unique, we can see that its trunk is super, super heavy from a wireframe perspective. So if we just turn off the leaves for a second and turn off B3 and just try to get this to draw faster in B2 and go into shaded mode, you can see that the trunk on this tree, it's neat looking, but it's a little tweaked down here. And so just remember that you can just go to your trunk, go to the mold, and then we can go and make some changes in here to kind of chill it out. So you can see it's spiraling at 140, so maybe if I lower the spiraling down and maybe the mold width I want to chill out a little bit. So I'm just trying to get rid of that kink inside there and lower the spiral. So now that kink is a little relaxed. That's in that preset. So hit OK. And then I can go back to B2, B3, and try getting the pine needles in there in shaded mode and see if it'll draw the whole thing. Chances are it'll stop. Yeah, see it just stopped. It does that. So just going to go into wireframe mode. Um, so that's one of the useful things to do. So that happens with a lot of the presets, not just in Conifer, but also in Broadleaf, is that some of them, the trunks are a little kinked up just because the trunk mold settings are just a little too exaggerated. Um, and then we can also see on that trunk that the resolution is really high on it as well. So the curving resolution's at 5 degrees. We could try and mess with that to adjust the geometry in there. And then the mold resolution we could go and put down to, let's say, 7. So now you can see that the trunk is lighter than it was before. So that's just your resolution settings, which conversely you also can go when you save it as an OBJ. We can see this tree, I'm just doing a count on it, is 2 million polys. And we can see that the trunk, you have control for the transversal and curving resolution inside here as well. So cool. So like I've mentioned, I've already exported a bunch of conifer trees from Onyx Conifer. So what we're going to do now is we're going to just jump over to Maya so we can take a look at them over there. And so if I close Onyx Conifer and go in here, let me just go and set my project to Onyx. And let's go and find my save number 1. And all right, got a couple trees in here. And let's start talking about the things we want to do in Maya to render some pine trees.